Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I know we have people joining us from all corners of the earth today. We have participants who are in Canberra. We've got attendees who are in South Africa. I know one person's also mentioned that they're currently in India. So, it's my exquisite delight really to welcome everyone to today's session. What also happens to be the last session for this year in the Women in Retirement Education series. I'm based in Canberra on Ngunnawal country, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of the land upon which today's workshop is going to be running and where I'm facilitating it from. Um, if you're so inclined, please feel free also to just contribute in the chat where you're joining in from, because it's really great to see that we're establishing a network of people who are interested in empowering themselves and empowering those around them. I know when it comes to talking about finances and financial situations, it's such a difficult topic to broach. There's still a lot of stigma, a lot of shame, embarrassment when it comes to these kinds of conversations, but that's exactly why it's so important for us to have them. And I just want to take a moment to also remind everyone that this is a safe space. The entire intention behind the Women in Retirement Education series is to bring people together, to make knowledge accessible and inclusive, so that it doesn't matter where you come from, what your background, what your story is. We all have something to share and we all have something to learn. And like the analogy of iron sharpening iron, here we're here to co-create pathways to talk about money and to use the information that we get to empower those around us. And so, without further ado, please allow me to introduce someone I'm basically fanning out to introduce right now, but I just have to keep my composure. We have the fabulous Rebecca Glenn, who I actually met about a year ago for the first time. We ended up meeting virtually. We still haven't actually met face to face.
True.
But the power of technology, doing an International Women's Day event. And after hearing her speak, in the back of my mind, I had always just locked it in that somehow, some way, one day, I really want to collaborate with Beck again. So thank you so much, Beck, for participating in this. We know that there's so many competing demands. It's December, we're trying to wrap up the year, things are crazy. So we appreciate it so much that you took the time to be here. Rebecca Glenn is the founder, CEO, managing director of the Center for Women's Economic Safety, does amazing work in the space of educating about economic abuse, understanding what it is. I know for one, there's things I didn't even know what economic abuse really was about. And so a huge part of her advocacy is speaking up about these issues that when it comes to, violence, it can take all forms and it's not limited to, the physical and the emotional space. It also happens, within the financial realm. So her advocacy in empowering and educating people about economic abuse, how to overcome it, also just general advocacy around, putting changes in place, not just from, an empowerment point of view, but from a policy perspective in terms of what more can be done to help more women reach economic safety. So Becca's going to be talking to us today about relationships and retirement. The whole point of this conversation is that it's a robust discussion, so please feel free to join in, ask a question, add your contribution, because like I said earlier, we're here to learn from one another, so this is not a lecture. And I hope Beck is at liberty for me to say that
100%.
We want this to be, imagine a casual cafe style conversation, but we get to put people together who would not ordinarily be together because of all of our varying circumstances. So Beck, we're so excited to hear what you have to say to us, what we're going to learn from this session. I will stop there because I could keep going on like forever about this kind of thing. I hand over to you, and we're so excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Fumikazi. And can you see my screen now? Is that
Yes,
looking?
we can.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm delighted to see that people are coming from all over. I do have to sort of say right up front that most of what I'm talking about will be in an Australian context, but I would love to hear from you as we go through, you know, your insights about how this applies where you are. So please feel free to sort of chip in. A casual cafe conversation, except of course I've got a PowerPoint for you to share. So all that means is that I might not be able to see. So if you can use perhaps the reactions that Teams has to put your hand up, or simply just open your mic so that I can hear that you want to ask a question, I'm very happy to take those questions as we sort of proceed through. I am also joining you from unceded Aboriginal land. In my case, that's the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people. So I would like to also pay my respects to elders past and present and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining this session today. I am going to be talking about finances and money today. I am not a financial advisor. I'm not a financial planner. I'm not a financial counsellor. And the information I'm going to share with you is general in nature, so it doesn't take into account your personal circumstances, and so shouldn't be seen as constituting financial advice. I do strongly encourage that you, before you act on anything you hear today, you assess or seek some other advice and see whether that kind of action might be appropriate for you or your financial situation. And I promise I will give some tips and leads as to where you can get unconflicted and low or no cost financial advice a bit later in the session. So you heard I'm the founder and CEO of the Centre for Women's Economic Safety, and our mission is really to support women at risk of experiencing or recovering from economic abuse in the context of domestic and family violence. In all of the work that we do, we are informed by women and non-binary folk with lived experience of economic abuse. So we have a lived experience advisory panel. And of course, we're informed every day, new insights, new learnings. Bomikazi said we're always in a position to learn more, and we find that absolutely in our work, that we continue to learn every day, not only about the kinds of tactics that perpetrators might use to commit economic abuse, but also just some of the resourcefulness of people who have experienced things they should never have to experience. So yeah, we're really driven by the idea that everyone deserves economic safety and security, and where there are systems in place that are making that harder, we advocate to try and reduce the impact and lower those barriers. So a bit about me, not being a financial planner. How did I come to this work? I've been working in financial wellbeing and financial literacy for about 10 years. And it was actually doing that work some years ago that opened my eyes to economic abuse for the first time. And I was running a grants program at Financial Literacy Australia, where we supported financial literacy programs right around the country. And there was an application to do some research into this thing called economic abuse, which I hadn't heard of. And as I investigated and learned more about it, I guess I had a real dawning that it's a very significant thing to be experiencing domestic violence, which almost always involves economic abuse, because a lot of the assumptions that we make about how to improve your financial well-being or your financial capability assume that you are free to make different and better choices about your finances. So that moment of realization that if you're not, where do you go and what do you do? And I realized there was very little out there for women. And that's, I guess, planted a seed for me, which has in time led me to be doing the work that I'm doing, underpinned by a passion for financial wellbeing for everyone. So for me to specialise in this area, I did go and spend some time working for a domestic violence agency and learning more about that, and realising that, you know, through a combination of my experience and background, we needed to develop some supports for people experiencing economic abuse that weren't otherwise available. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about the work that we do, that Centre for Women's Economic Safety, and some of those supports a little bit later. But I want to start by talking a little bit about this concept of economic safety. So people often ask me, the Centre for Women's Economic Safety, what do you mean by that? And I guess what we're talking about is really a continuum from a basic human right to be free of economic abuse, to be in receipt of fair and appropriate financial support for your health and well-being, like at a really basic human rights level, and also for others in your care. Financial inclusion, that is having appropriate financial products to help you manage your finances. And importantly, I think this speaks to some of the systems work that we do, is having that structural and systemic support to maintain and build your financial well-being over time. And of course, that piece, that building your financial well-being over time, is really this continuum that we're talking about, that we talk about anyway, through to economic security. So as we talk about retirement and relationships, you know, we all have an ambition, or maybe we don't, but most people I know have some ambition for some economic security over the longer term, being able to retire with dignity. And so we talk about economic security as having that stable and appropriate housing, being free of debt or having entirely manageable debt. Sustainable income that enables some degree of choice, both now and over time. Sufficient savings and insurances for unexpected expenses and life events, as well as savings for retirement. And I'm going to do a little bit more sort of context setting as we get into this presentation. So this is a model of financial well-being that I particularly like and has influenced the way that we think about financial well-being and how best to support it. Because it's an ecological model. So you can see that the core of sort of financial well-being, the green canopy of the tree, you know, financial well-being being in control of your finances, being able to meet expenses with some left over, and having some financial security or a means through which to achieve that over time. But of course, just as the tree needs water, sunshine, and good roots and soil, financial health is also impacted by many external factors. And so you can see in this model, you know, the clouds and the sky, and also some of those factors in the earth. So in the air, we can see health, you know, has a very big impact on financial well-being, household and community conditions, life events which result in a financial shock. And that can include all sorts of things, but particularly in the work that I do, I see that domestic violence piece having a very big impact in that sort of in that area. And in the earth, of course, there are those other influences, such as financial capability, the resources and social capital that any individual has, or the household has, or a family has, and financial inclusion. So in the work that I do, I can see every day, of course, that having an abusive partner or a family member is really one of the most devastating impacts on all of these factors. It often results in divorce, with subsequent flow-on effects to health, often impacts and interrupts work. It can increase the unpaid care commitments someone has, results in less secure housing, can impact on confidence, it erodes savings, and very often any assets that someone has built up are eaten up in family law proceedings or other litigation. So it's against this backdrop that I really want to present today, the impact of financial and economic abuse on women's economic safety and security. You can see how different the impact of domestic abuse and all of those cascading things that can occur as a result of that, how different some of those positive impacts on financial well-being, that is, that you are in a healthy relationship, you have familial and community support, savings, diverse assets, insurance, employability, and so on and so forth. So I want to focus on three factors in particular when it comes to your finances in relationships and thinking about retirement. So firstly, consideration of the appropriateness of financial products. And in particular, I'm going to talk about what that means around joint products. Also, superannuation and divorce. and some options to increase financial safety. So as you can see by what I've highlighted there, this is by no means all of the considerations for someone's financial well-being, but there's some pretty important ones and ones that we often don't talk about enough. So let's start by talking about healthy money relationships. As Bomakazi said, you know, we often don't make enough time to talk about money, and we're uncomfortable about that. And in fact, we're often not even sure what a good conversation about money looks like. So when we're talking about in a family or in an intimate relationship, there are some key principles of healthy money relationships. So the first is this concept of sharing. So financial decisions and responsibilities are shared. And even if one person is doing the money management, not one single person bears sole responsibility for those decisions. The second is transparency, and that's both partners have a right to get information about the couple's financial position and to ask questions to make sure that they understand it. And the third is having a voice. So that is, while we shouldn't expect to always agree on everything, that the opinions and the goals and the needs of both partners really do matter when making financial decisions. And so I wanted to start with that because I think one of the challenges in identifying economic abuse, as with emotional and psychological abuse, is that sometimes there are behaviours which, taken in isolation, may not look like abuse, and of course may not even be abuse. You know, we talk often about how it can start really subtly, and so an example of that might be you know, one partner saying to the other, look, you've got enough on your plate, let me take care of the bills, I'll look after the finances. Now that may indeed be, and often is, the act of a loving and caring partner who wants to reduce the burden on someone they love. And it can also be potentially the first and deliberate step to undermine someone's financial independence. So why I like to share these principles of healthy money relationships is that it helps us to understand the difference. So if you're not seeing these things, then that kind of offer may not be all it's cracked up to be. And a very good place to sort of start is to have a conversation with your partner about money. And if you know that you are absolutely too scared to even think about that prospect, then that's a pretty good sign that something is not quite right. So let's head to the other end of the spectrum, beyond unhealthy. So if we talk about healthy, then there's this grey area, and then where we at the other end of the spectrum is really abusive. So economic abuse is a pattern of abusive behaviour where a person behaves in a way that controls their partner or their family member's capacity to acquire money or resources. So, for instance, by working or receiving support from others, that can include government payments. It might control their partner's ability to use money or resources for things they need, for instance, food, clothes, petrol, medicine, or things for their children. Or the third way is to interfere with a person's ability to maintain money or resources. So that could look like taking or spending money meant for the household and spending it on other things, or incurring debt in the other person's name. Now, I am talking about economic abuse, but financial abuse really is just a subset of economic abuse, specifically related to money and finances. Now, importantly for us to determine that these kinds of behaviours, again, which in isolation may not be abuse, but in a pattern, and where that pattern of behaviours limits another person's autonomy or undermines their financial well-being, that's when it becomes economic abuse. And there are three main categories that have been identified of economic abuse. There are a couple of others that are being looked at, but mostly they fall into these three categories of control. So that is restriction, exploitation, and sabotage. And I want to say, as we start to talk about, retirement, we are talking about people who are starting to look at that. So I'm guessing, and I could be wrong, and I'd love it if there are young people on this call today, but often when we start to talk about retirement and relationships, we are talking with an older sort of cohort. But it's really important to understand that economic abuse does not end when a relationship with an abuser ends. It can, usually that's when there's been a death or incarceration. If there's not a death or incarceration, then we're very often seeing that post-separation economic abuse will continue. So we're going to take a look at some examples of post-separation economic abuse in just a minute. But let's talk about prevalence and impact. So conservative estimates suggest that more than 1 in 6 women in Australia will experience economic abuse by their current or former partner. It's estimated between 78 and 99% of women presenting to domestic and family violence services have experienced this form of abuse. And importantly, to the point of how we build financial well-being towards retirement, between 70 and 75% of women who leave an abusive partner leave behind property or assets. So it's very, very common to leave an abusive partner and really have that sense of you're having to start again from scratch, because that's the reality often. So that's a big impact. And you can see there some of those further impacts. We certainly find from our lived experience panel, we did a survey to discover that 94% of women and non-binary people on that panel were left after separation to pay for shared financial liabilities or debts belonging to their ex-partner. Bureau of Statistics data shows us that 63% of survivors in high financial stress actually have a history of economic abuse. Sorry, 63% of women in high financial stress have a history of economic abuse. And we know in Australia, and I suspect, but maybe there are some cultural differences, certainly in Australia, we do have a problem with a growing rate of older women going into homelessness. So you can probably see why it is that we're passionate about the work that we do, and understanding that women are experiencing economic abuse at twice the rate of men, and they're doing so against this existing structural economic disadvantage of the gender pay gap, the subsequent and corresponding superannuation gap. And of course, we know that women spend substantially more time on unpaid care work and make up more than 80% of single parent households. Now, I'm going to, on the next screen, I'm going to share some examples of economic abuse. And if this does raise any issues for you, or you need to step away from the session, I do encourage you to do that, do whatever you need to do, and I'll share some resources towards the end of the session. But in the meantime, there is always 1-800-RESPECT for people in Australia if you want to speak to someone immediately about any concerns this has raised for you. Okay, so heading on to the next screen, which is where I'm going to share some tactics of economic abuse with you. So I've selected some. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. And what I've done here is selected some tactics of post-separation economic abuse that we quite often see that could impact your retirement options. And I've divided them up across those 3 categories. So restriction, exploitation, and sabotage. So the kinds of things that we see in that restriction category, really common for a perpetrator to hide financial information and assets. It could be that they unreasonably deny spousal maintenance that would otherwise be appropriate in that situation to be determined by courts. And using children to limit options about where you can live, or as a threat to prevent further economic claims. In terms of that exploitation piece, some of the tactics we see there include potentially using a family business, a line of credit that might be associated with that to run down the property pool. It could be, and we flagged this earlier, that a lot of people are left with joint debts, or indeed debts that the other partner should be responsible for, just absconding and leaving them with the victim survivor. And super common in Australia, and I understand this to be a global problem where child support systems exist that perpetrators simply refuse to pay and undertake quite sort of sophisticated levels of manipulation of their finances to avoid or minimise the amount of child support they pay. And then in that last column, that sabotage realm, we see obviously the damaging property that's simply withheld and it's too unsafe to go and collect it. So significant cost impact of that. Simply refusing to pay rent or mortgage repayments where there's still an obligation to do so. And unfortunately, really common is using legal systems abuse to create costs for the victim survivor. So some of those concerns led us to really take a closer look at banking products. And so I thought I'll share some of the watch-outs on banking products, the ways in which they can be weaponized by people perpetrating economic abuse that can have a significant impact on financial well-being. The Centre for Women's Economic Safety published a paper last year called Designed to Disrupt Reimagining Banking Products to Improve Financial Safety. And that was really out of recognition of what we were seeing, that it didn't seem right and the burden and the barriers to justice seemed too high for many victim survivors who were ending up in these financial situations because of the way a perpetrator had misused financial and banking products. So let's talk about a couple of those. So joint accounts, certainly in Australia and certainly Anglo culture, the joint account is a very common, I guess, symbol of commitment between two people. And very often the way a joint account will be set up for reasons of, just easier to sort of run your day-to-day finances if it's an either to sign scenario. So that means while there are two people on the account, either one of you can spend money, approve a payment and so on. Now, where there's abuse and where someone might be concerned about the behaviour of their partner, you can change the method of operation on that account to be two to sign. That can protect funds in the account, but it becomes very unwieldy in just a sort of a day-to-day operation thing. And it can sometimes be dangerous for people who are experiencing domestic violence to request that change on a bank account. So that's a concern with joint accounts. So we always think it's really good practice for individuals to have their own bank accounts and in a healthy money relationship, potentially, if it works, have a joint account, but have really clear agreement about what it's used for, what the kind of limits are that you both agree can be spent without getting consent of the other person. Credit cards, we often see these, with digital applications that can be, very easy to open credit cards in another person's name without their consent. And we think that it would be good practice for financial institutions to introduce a little bit more friction. So there's been a very big push towards reducing friction to make finances easier for people, but it does come with some risks. And I think that that's worth looking at what an appropriate balance is there. Something that we see a lot of in our practice is, again, a bit of a misunderstanding of credit cards, particularly where there's a secondary card on an account. So very often we'll find that women are left with a credit card debt and they are responsible for that credit card debt because the account's in their name. And they'll say, but he was spending it on his card. In Australia, the concept of a joint credit card account is very, very rare. Most of the majors don't offer it. So most people who have a credit card account where their partner also has a card, or they have a card and their partner has it, it's actually one person's account and the other person just has a card on it. So it's one person with liability. Another, I guess, a watch out. And mortgages. And we have a very deep concern about mortgages and the way that is creating all sorts of really significant costs for women who are trying to leave an abusive partner. So mortgages are what is called joint and severally liable. not well understood, and I don't think often financial institutions do enough at the origination of a home loan to explain to people what that actually means. Many people go into a mortgage, together with this idea that we're both going to shoulder the burden of that and that this is a 50-50 proposition. Joint and severally liable, I'm not a lawyer, and they use different language to explain it, but essentially it means that a bank or financial institution can come after either party for the full amount. So you're both together and individually liable for the entire amount of that loan. That does present some issues when someone is trying to leave an abusive partner, because quite often we'll see a perpetrator just stop making repayments. They may refuse to agree to different terms. So if a woman has been left with mortgage repayments and struggling to meet those repayments, she might call the bank and say, I'm struggling to meet them. And they will then require often, and they're getting better at having some discretion of where domestic violence is alleged, but a bank may then require both parties to agree to it. Now, well, an abusive partner who's deliberately trying to use products to cause difficulty, that they very rarely consent to that. And so a person can be trapped not only by the person using violence, but by some of the systems and the products that they have engaged with together. Donna-Kazi, should I just pause there? I'm going to move on to superannuation and divorce shortly, but I might just pause there to see if there are any questions at this point. How are people travelling? Is there anything in the chat?
Not in the chat yet. I don't know if everyone would echo these sentiments. I feel like you've opened up a whole new world of things I didn't know. And as you're speaking now, my mind is starting to think about, oh my goodness, especially that slide where you defined economic abuse about that it's not just about, partners who can inflict it, but it's also family members.
Yeah.
And I think having seen that, it makes so much sense that it's essentially manipulating a relationship.
Yes.
Any relationship. And
Yep.
so whether it's a cousin, a parent, whatever the case may be, it's exploiting that relationship to coerce someone to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do simply because you're a loved one.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so
So we see
yeah.
that with carers as well, particularly. So we have there are very high rates of women with disability experience economic abuse. They experience it. I think it's more like 24% of women with a disability experience economic abuse compared to the national average of 17%. So I think, it's a really important point that perpetrators will use the instruments available to them, or should I say, they will misuse the instruments available to them. And so those instruments can differ depending on the relationship,
Right.
depending on the culture, depending on the context.
Yeah.
So those three things are always at play. So that's where we see, in an Anglo culture, the joint account is this symbol of trust and love. But we see, for instance, in subcontinent families, particularly where there's expat families in Australia, in the Indian, there's this concept of familial, sharing of resources where you send remittances home. That can also be a lovely and loving thing. Again, if it's misused, it becomes abusive, and so we see that as well. Yeah, so it's an interesting.
Yeah, this is really like, when they say knowledge is power, because if you don't have, necessarily the vocabulary to understand what's happening to you, you can't describe it. And I'm just thinking, in instances where you're almost bullied into doing something financially because you're a friend. I thought we were friends, or you're my cousin, or you're my daughter, etc. And that, how do I put it? Like the manipulation of that relationship.
Manipulation.
Yes, to get someone to do something that you want to do. But I also love the fact that you've shared green flags, right? Because we so often see the red flags when it comes to violence and abuse, but the green flags are there as well. And I think that was an excellent resource to draw upon. But I don't want to monopolize the conversation. If anyone has any thoughts they want to share, please feel free to chip in. I know Sherilyn has just said that this is some great information to pass on. But it just seems, for women that the odds just keep being stacked against us. The starting blocks are just so staggering as it is, and now you need to think about ways in which you can protect yourselves. Even if you go into a relationship with the best of intentions, um, the onus is again always on the victim to find measures in place to empower themselves. And I'm
Yeah,
seeing this playing out here again. So much unlearning, I think, from my end in terms of what financial abuse is and challenging that assumed knowledge that it only happens to a certain kind of person or within a certain type of relationship when it could happen to anyone.
yes, I've just accidentally gone to the wrong screen there. Hang on, bear with me a moment while I get us back to where we were. Okay.
I wish everyone had access to this information. Like, okay, thankfully it's going to be up on YouTube. So if you want to share this with your network, your girlfriends, your family, whatever the case may be, the recording is available after the session on YouTube for, again, to make this information accessible to everyone, because
Thank you, Bomakazi.
this is a game changer to me. Like, listening to this kind of conversation has been wowza.
So I promised to talk about superannuation and divorce. So moving on from sort of bank products that we, commonly use or have interactions with every day. Superannuation, we often set and forget. And of course, that's part of the beauty of superannuation, but it is often our biggest or second biggest asset. So under the Family Law Act, it is considered as an asset, even though it sort of is, a little bit different from a house and it's not liquid because it's held in trust. But when couples separate, either party's superannuation can be split either by an order of the Federal Court or the Family Court of Australia or Western Australia, or by an agreement, a superannuation agreement. So that's if both parties can agree. But of course, for people experiencing domestic violence, often that will not be the case. And in fact, we see very commonly in our practice ex-partners simply refusing to disclose information about their superannuation. And that's really important as part of family law property settlement proceedings. Thankfully, we have seen some progress in the last few years, and there have been changes in family law which now mean that you can request through the family law court registries to get information about your partner's superannuation via the tax office. So it used to be simply, you asked nicely for that information, and if the perpetrator said no, it was like it's off the table, which was ridiculous. And there are still a few aspects of family law that work that way, but very hopeful that this shift is, the first of many more shifts that start to, as you said, Bomakazi, start to reduce the burden on survivors who are being left to do all of the work. And the heavy lifting on any sort of form of economic justice. But I do want to say in relation to superannuation and divorce that if you're experiencing economic abuse, your partner is exerting control beyond separation in any way financially, then I do encourage you to get legal advice as soon as possible. I know very often that is out of reach financially. If you've been experiencing economic abuse, you don't tend to have, pots of money you're able to access to get costly legal advice. But thankfully, there are a growing number of services that can give you low or no cost advice, and I'll share some links to where you can find some of those a bit later. I do, when I'm presenting, always like to share lived experience, because I think it sort of just brings home what we're talking about. This is real world consequences and impacts. And this was a quote from a lived experience advisory panel member speaking of some of the injustice that can occur through superannuation and the use of systems. So I'll read this quote to you. The thing that really got me was I had to pay him half my super after everything I endured. all of the police reports and everything. Family law was just horrendous. And because of the screwy co-parenting orders of the court, I can't engage in the corporate world in the same way anymore. So it's impossible to get back to where I was. And so I think that really speaks to that there is no sense or requirement in family law currently, and we're hoping that's about to change, for the court to consider domestic violence or economic abuse when it comes to that property settlement. So enormously unfair and at odds with the way law and tort law works in almost every other jurisdiction. And we're hoping that that law in Australia is about to shift so that the family law court will have to take into account economic abuse. And of course, some of those related areas like parenting. So, we're recently supporting a woman who's, the court-ordered parenting arrangement has forced her to move back into a city that's really expensive from the country where she owned a property. So she had to sell that property to rent in a city where she can't afford to rent, just so that the person who has abused her for years can have access to their child. Not justice at all. And another lived experience advisory panel member quote, so if you're not familiar with the term, an SMSF is a self-managed super fund. It's treated a bit differently. I'll talk about it in a second. But this is where we see a sort of a psychological threat wrapped up in an economic instrument. He set up an SMSF and we both put in about $80,000, but he took out a $2 million life insurance policy against me in the fund. The fees meant we went backward. So not only is that undermining their financial position, it was being used as a threat against her life as well. So often economic abuse becomes intertwined with other forms of abuse as a way of exerting control. So I mentioned self-managed super funds are really, most people are sort of in a fund that is managed by an organisation. This is a fund that you manage yourself in a group of up to, say, 6 people to help you save for retirement. So very often you see these being set up in families or by couples, providing a greater level of choice and freedom for investments. But of course, if you start to think about the overlay in the context that we're talking about in domestic and family violence, it can be used as a way to coerce someone into making decisions or managing that fund in a way that only benefits one party. So under law, self-managed super funds, every member of a self-managed super fund is responsible for the investment decisions, and it has to comply with obviously all, applicable tax and super laws. But there can really be negative impacts on your SMSF if a relationship breaks down. So it can be manipulated by an abusive partner. We've seen it can be used as, life insurance can be used as a threat. A person might remove your access to it. They might also try and coerce you into making decisions that you don't necessarily agree to, or may or may not feel like you benefit from, and being pressured into rolling your existing super into a joint fund like this can really potentially increase vulnerability. So we do obviously, it's very difficult if you're already in a situation, but certainly if you're a member of an SMSF, you need to be looking at the financial advice that you take. Only use a trusted and registered financial advisor. I'll send a link to the Financial Advisors Register, but you can look them up to make sure that they're the right thing. Often you see in SMSFs, it's the kind of the mates network. Oh, my mate knows finance. So caution, all of that. And the other consideration here is obviously, further abuse can occur if the perpetrator steals your financial information, your tax file number, your MyGov account. And we do see that fraud can happen through the self-managed super fund in that way. It's very hard to get money back if your money is stolen by a perpetrator or other trusted person in an SMSF. And that's a significant drawback of this type of super fund. Industry funds or retail super funds, which are the ones that are run by other organisations and you put your money in potentially through your employer on a regular basis. But if you lose your money through theft or fraud in a regulated fund like that, you may well have access to government compensation schemes. You can't if it's an SMSF. So it's another consideration as you think about whether or not that's going to be right for you. If you have experienced some fraudulent activity, you've got concerns there's a financial hardship being caused through this instrument, do contact the ATO immediately and reach out to a financial counsellor who can potentially support you to get your finances back on track. We talked about some of the steps you can take to improve and increase your financial safety. If you are getting into a relationship, especially later in life, or you have assets already as you're getting into that relationship, then I really do strongly encourage you to consider a binding financial agreement. They've been given a bad name, prenuptial agreements and so on, but they really can save an awful lot of angst when a relationship breaks down, whether there's been abuse or not. But you will need to get legal advice on that. I'll talk about that and a bit more about what's involved in that in a second. If you are already in a relationship and you're concerned about your financial safety, there are some steps you can take. Not every one of these might be safe to take, but if it's safe to do so, things you can consider are creating a private email address. So one that you don't already have, if you don't already have one that your partner doesn't know about, you could look at creating one. Ideally, you do that on a device that they don't have access to. So not your phone or your computer, but potentially at work or a friend's computer or device. If you're able to obtain copies of important documents, could be about your superannuation, your bank, your marriage certificate, your identity documents, or at least photos of them. If it seems relevant in your case, you want to check your credit score. All of the credit reporting bodies are obliged to provide that to you for free every 3 months. There's more information on our website about how to do that. So that's a good thing to just check if there's anything suspect on your credit report. And of course, if you don't already, then it's really worth looking at having a bank account that's opened in your name only. If you've got safety concerns around that, then do look at potentially going to a different institution to make sure there's no sort of cross-contamination. So what do we do? The Centre for Women's Economic Safety really has 2 primary objectives, and that's firstly assisting women who are experiencing economic abuse by connecting them with appropriate information, services and support for their economic safety. And secondly, working to reduce the impact of economic abuse by sharing their lived experiences to improve some of those service and system responses to it. So in terms of the immediate support, that Financial Safety National website, financialsafety.org.au, I'll share the link with you later, but that's really got a lot of information that's got an economic abuse of family violence lens to it and can support sort of more informed decision making and also service navigation. So there's a directory in there. And we also run money clinics. So this is free and confidential one-on-one sessions with a trained and violence-informed financial counsellor. So they're able to help you sort of work through your options, think about things that might increase your financial safety and so on. And look, I do just want to say there are some things you can do, but no matter how savvy you are, a determined perpetrator will find a way to cost you, will find a way to misuse a system against you. And that's really why, while we continue these efforts to support people experiencing it, why we have that second pillar of effort, that we need to reduce the burden on victim survivors. We need supportive systems You know, we saw with the financial well-being model that I shared earlier that without those supportive systems, without inclusive financial products that take into account that relationships end, that 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence in Australia, if those, you know, good, solid, healthy roots and soil aren't there, it's very, very difficult to maintain financial well-being, no matter how well educated you are and what skills you have. So that's why we continue to advocate for the changes that we do. Now, I'm aware I need to leave some time, but we're almost out of time. So look, I'm going to just actually stop sharing. I think I've got a better list than this. And we'll be able to share these resources. So obviously you can't see the links there, hyperlinks there, but you can Google superannuation splitting on the Attorney General's website. There's some really, really good resources, both from the Centre for Women's Economic Safety and our financial safety website, but also from other organisations. So from government, there's some really good information about separating with debt, which is a guide to legal options. That's available on the Attorney General's website as well. So that's those super debt and divorce, those resources are available. I mentioned legal advice can be really expensive. So any information that you can obtain that's not going to cost you will really help save you costs in the long run. So excuse me, the government, excuse me, I'm going to cough. Been talking too long. Yeah. The government has a family violence law help website. And on the financial safety website, we've got a directory. So you can search under legal and your location if you're in Australia in the financial safety website, and that will take you to some resources that include free legal advice, but also some low cost legal advice, particularly around family law. So there's a range of resources that you can find via the directory on the financial safety website. We have on the CWES website the financial safety checklist and also more information about money clinics. And you can get online and make an appointment for a money clinic directly. Money clinics are available to women, non-binary and feminine identifying people in Australia. So that's the only criteria. There's no income or assets test, no residency requirements, and we do have a translating and interpreting service available if you need that to access the money clinics. In terms of your superannuation, or if you're looking at or thinking about superannuation and any interaction that might have with the age pension or that kind of thing, in the first instance, there's often some free advice, limited advice that the superannuation fund can provide you. So do look up your super fund online or give them a call and see what free advice that they can provide you. And in terms of government support, again, there's a little known service that Services Australia runs called the Financial Information Service. And that's, again, well worth a look if you're thinking about what is the interaction of tax with the benefit with superannuation. There's often some sort of complex equations happening around those things, and they're well placed to provide you, again, some free advice and options. So I will stop sharing that and share one final screen with you. They're the two main websites that I've been referencing. So the financial safety website and the CWES website. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm sorry I've taken almost the entire hour, but if there are any questions, very happy to answer them.
Not at all. I really feel that we could have gone on with this conversation for so much longer because there's so much to unpack. Each slide was mind-blowing for me. But before, Vic goes away, I just want to ask, does anyone have any questions, things they want to ask? If you feel that, you're a little bit too shy to do so in this platform, please reach out use those resources that Beck has shared with us. Even just the website for CWES. I think there's a lot of information that can help us unpack this topic of economic abuse. Because as it was mentioned earlier in today's presentation, is that it's a spectrum. And like inequality, there's really no part where it begins and ends, because when there's relationships involved, it becomes this
messy
tumble dryer of emotions, family dynamics, of economic trajectories that are part of it all. So Beck, thank you so much for presenting to us today. I know I can speak for myself that I learned so much about this session. I wish we had more conversations around this topic, because you don't know what you don't know until you know it, right? So you really challenged my assumed knowledge around what economic abuse is, seeing what some of the green flags are, because those are really, good resources to draw upon when you're in a healthy and a safe environment. But I think some of the key takeaways from this presentation is the importance of being proactive about your finances. You talked about legal advice, but I wanted to highlight the independent legal advice part.
Yeah.
Right. Acquiring independent legal advice, protecting your financial position, and that could be as simple as having your own copies of important documents. Because, if the relationship turns sour, then again, people can withhold that information and use it against you. So unfortunately, we have to prepare ourselves for these things. And I think we've also learned that as women, there's just so much we need to think about. I see there's a hand up. I'm going to pass this over to Latif.
No, sorry, I think it was a wrong. Yes, it was a
Yeah.
wrong. I was looking at the chat, yeah.
Okay, perhaps you wanted to react and then you raise your hand. I've done that myself on a couple of occasions. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Beck. And like I've been saying, I know I sound like a broken record. The intention behind these sessions is that we keep these conversations going offline. Please use the information that you know to debunk, demystify, empower those around you, whether it's your daughters, your siblings, your girlfriends, because you never know whose life and financial position or just financial attitude that this might change. And if it has a positive impact on just one person, then we've achieved the objective here. Because we're here to co-create and empower one another. And if you have any questions and you want to email me, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always on LinkedIn. You can drop me an email. I'd love to have a chat with you. If you have ideas of other sessions, I know that this was the last one for the year, but I want to keep the Women in Retirement Education series going. I've got a couple of things lined up for next year. I'm not going to give out too much. I just want us to unpack this and not archive it, forget about it, and move on. Because I know I won't. This will also be up on YouTube. I think I did mention that earlier. In case you want to go back and listen to the recording, it's going to be available online for you to share with anyone as well. I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are. South Africa, India, Australia. Thank you, everyone from all over the globe for making this possible. It doesn't work unless we all come together to have these conversations. I can't remember there was so much I wanted to say, but now I've gone blank. But thank you to you, Beck, and thank you to the attendees for taking the time out of your busy schedule to just learn more about this topic and what it is and how it can affect your life, but also your retirement outcomes. I'm quite passionate about talking about retirement because, we put it off as if it's this far away thing that we don't have to think about. But, if we want to live long, we have to think about it. And we know that, you know, your retirement savings will form the hugest chunk of your financial portfolio one day. And so we can't afford to not think about the proactive steps that we can take to build and to protect our wealth. And if you're interested in watching the recordings for the other women in retirement education presentations, they're all available on YouTube. And so on that note, I wish you all a pleasant day further. Please let me know if you have any questions or topic ideas. I'm going to stop recording at this point, and I wish you a wonderful festive season as we wrap up this year. It's been a crazy 2023, but I feel like we've finished it off with a bang. Having these conversations has really fueled me to keep going and to keep these discussions flowing with everyone. If you're going to be traveling for the holidays, safe travels. We will reconvene in 2024, re-energized, refreshed, ready to empower and educate. And that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phomikazi. See you, everyone.